Good morning. I'm Arthur Huxham, working for the Sprout base in Cardiff. I'm here with Dr. Jamie Shea, who works for NATO. Good morning.
Good morning, Arthur.
Good morning. First of all, starting at the personal level, when and how did you come to join the NATO international staff? And since you have been working here, what other positions have you held?
Well, I came here in 1980, so a long time ago, back in the days of the Cold War. I really came to Brussels because when I was at a university back in the early 1970s, the UK was just joining the European Union, and my generation, not everybody of course, but a lot of us really considered that this was the new frontier, as it were, for Britain moving into Europe. We all went on trips to Brussels, no doubt like you have done, to visit NATO and the European institutions, and that gave me the idea of working in Europe in an international organisation. I looked at both institutions, both the EU and NATO, but I already had a very strong interest for defence and security issues, so I pressed it more in the NATO direction. Miraculously was accepted, I still don't know why, so came out in 1980 and joined the international staff. Been here ever since, had a variety of different positions. I'll spare you the details because I think it would be rather tedious. But most notably, at least as far as my own career is concerned, I was the NATO spokesman in the 1990s, where I was, for a while at least, Andy Warhol, famous for 15 minutes. I was prominent for a short period during the Bosnian and Kosovo campaigns, when of course NATO was very much on the front pages of all the newspapers. I ran NATO's public diplomacy programs for a few years, then moved on to be the Director of Policy Planning at NATO, working on the future sort of vision of the organisation for the period after our commitment in Afghanistan. And over the last 5 years, I've been the Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges, which I know is a rather long and rather sort of meaningless job title. People think, what does that mean? In a nutshell, it means that I have the responsibility to sort of take forward what we used to call non-traditional threats, like cyber, like terrorism, weapons of mass destruction, energy security issues, although frankly they've become much more traditional over the last couple of years.
Looking back on your career in NATO, would you say that the NATO bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade was one of your more challenging moments personally?
Yes, it was, because I referred to this already. This was the Kosovo air campaign back in 1999, which really, for the best part of 3 months, had NATO every day as the top news story. We had hundreds of journalists here permanently camped out downstairs, press conferences every day of the week. We were permanently in the crosshairs of the international media, and it was a difficult campaign. In retrospect, for a military campaign it was short, but at the time it seemed to be going on for an eternity. And like in all military operations, a lot of things went wrong, which were unpredictable, and managing those incidents was crucial in order to maintain public support. Collateral damage, that term, which is now depressingly familiar, became prominent for the first time. And of course the Chinese embassy was particularly difficult. We didn't know it was going to happen, so we weren't prepared for it. Happened in the middle of the night. It obviously was important, not just because of the civilian casualties and the embarrassment that always leads to, but because clearly NATO would never have intended to hit an embassy. That was not part of the target list. And a country like China still is a permanent member of the Security Council, and therefore in terms of UN support and legitimacy, that could be very complicated. So that was really tough thing to manage, and of course it gave rise to all sorts of conspiracy theories as to why it had been a target. So yeah, I had a particularly difficult time handling that.
Your career in NATO has spanned the campaigns in the Balkans in the 1990s, in Afghanistan and Iraq in the 2000s, and more recently the campaigns in Libya and the current ones in Syria and again in Iraq. What lessons do you think should be drawn from that history, and do you think the transatlantic alliance has satisfactorily learnt those lessons?
Well, I would hope so. I think the first thing is that you need transatlantic solidarity. If you're going to do something like intervening in another country, make sure that you have the full commitment of all of the allies, United States and Europe. I lived in my first intervention through the Bosnian years, and they were difficult precisely because the Europeans were on the ground in a major UN force and the Americans were not. And you had big policy differences about how to handle that crisis, which side to support, and frankly that paralysed NATO for several years, and we had 100,000 dead in Bosnia. We had the Srebrenica massacre, which everybody remembers, in 1995. And I think that with earlier NATO action, with more transatlantic commonality, we could have avoided all of that. We could have stopped the conflict in 1992 and putting Bosnia back together again as a functioning state, which is still very difficult, would have been considerably easier. So I think the first lesson is act early. Don't wait for the situation to spiral out of control. Transatlantic solidarity. Bring your strategy in line with your means. It's no good having very, very ambitious strategies to create a Switzerland in a place like Afghanistan or Kosovo or Bosnia if you're not willing to devote the time, the energy and the means. At the end of the day, there's no such thing as a perfect intervention. Of course not. It's very difficult to reconstruct societies that have been torn out by war. But when you look at Syria today, where there's been no intervention, and where you have 400,000 dead, you have 6.5 million refugees, you have 12 million people displaced, you have the whole country destroyed to the extent that the World Bank estimates that it will cost about $170 billion today to reconstruct Syria. So when there's no international intervention, you have to ask yourself whether that produces a happier outcome than when there is an intervention. Now, I think the lesson very briefly for the future is we need to have something that you could call smart interventions, which is that we have to sort of have something between doing nothing and putting hundreds of thousands of troops on the ground, which clearly very few people want to do in the wake of the experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan, and where you can outstay your welcome with the locals. That's true. So we have to have sort of something in between, a mixture of the use of military power, the use of diplomacy, the use of sanctions, the use of economic instruments, which can at least stabilise these conflicts, calm them down, produce lasting ceasefires, humanitarian aid, and produce a process to at least move away from these civil wars. Because if we don't do that, you see now with the refugee crisis in Europe, ultimately the whole thing gets out of control, and then we also suddenly see that these are not conflicts in faraway places, but things that can affect us directly.
In the context of the broader, not just military security and defence dimension, would the alliance be strengthened, weakened, or unaffected by a British withdrawal from the European Union? And how would you see a British withdrawal from the EU affect how NATO works over the long term?
Well, of course, in any community of democracies, the people get to have a vote. That's crucial, and countries obviously determine their own future. And we in NATO go around obviously saying to the Russians that countries like Georgia and Ukraine have the right to determine their own future, whether that be NATO membership, EU membership. That's a fundamental right. So obviously when it comes to NATO countries already in the alliance, we have to respect the same principle. Countries can determine their own future. There's nothing that says that you have to stay in an alliance or an organisation forever. We're only strong to the extent that membership reflects a democratic choice, and we go around obviously all the time seeking public support for NATO membership. So the first principle, of course, is that this is a choice clearly on June the 23rd for the British people and the British people alone. Having said that, and speaking entirely personally, as I said at the beginning of our talk, I come from this generation of the 1970s, which was very enthusiastic about EU membership, overcoming Britain's sort of traditional isolationism, adjusting to the fact that the empire was no longer there, that we were now a European country, and that our future was with our European neighbours and friends on the other side of the channel. And looking back over the last 50 years or so, to my mind, it's been a massive success story. I think the UK has made the EU considerably stronger, more open, less protectionist, with a stronger foreign a common foreign policy, for example, more influential in the world. But I think also EU membership has transformed the UK. I mean, the quality of coffee in London, the mixture now of cultures and populations, the quality of the food. No, in so many ways, the number of Brits who have homes in Europe and travel in both directions. So to my mind, it's been a good success story for both sides. We in NATO, frankly, look to the EU now to be our security partner, because we realise that in dealing with many situations, we can't do it alone. We don't have all the instruments we need. For example, if we're looking at hybrid warfare, what do we do to stop a country like Russia destabilising us through media campaigns, cyber attacks, potentially sabotage of critical infrastructure? We don't have all of the instruments in NATO to deal with that situation. The EU does. So therefore, it's not a question of a weak EU is good for a stronger NATO, or a weaker NATO is good for a strong EU. No, it doesn't work that way at all. We need the EU as our partner to have that full range of instruments, whether it's helping the Libyans out now with their national unity government, the interventions that you mentioned earlier, where the EU often provides the civilian reconstruction, dealing with these hybrid warfare scenarios. So if a UK exit from the EU would considerably weaken the EU, as well as Britain, as I personally believe it would, that's not good news for NATO in terms of our ability to meet our own security challenges.
Despite the fact that NATO and the EU are separate organisations with different memberships and functions, there has been a long debate about how the two could collaborate, as you said, more effectively together. What are the main remaining challenges to improve that collaboration, and would overcoming those challenges be easier or harder if Britain were to vote to leave the EU?
Well, the UK has steadfastly advocated, as I have myself, a closer NATO-EU relationship, a more pragmatic relationship, and looking at those areas where we overlap. But the UK is not the only country, but it's been a major champion. And of course, the British, with their very important armed forces, very professional, very experienced, very competent, well equipped, are key to the success of both organisations. For example, the UK, of course, plays a big role in NATO, providing also part of the nuclear deterrent, so ability across the board, but also the Brits, for example, with their ships in the Mediterranean, are a key part of controlling migration there. And the UK has commanded the EU operation dealing with piracy in the Gulf of Aden, which has had massive success in massively reducing the incidence of piracy against tankers and commercial vessels going up to the Suez Canal. And nobody talks about that any longer in the press, precisely because the problem has almost been solved. So to some degree, as I say, we need the British contribution for both organisations. But the Brits work very hard to bring our organisations closer together, and the areas, as I said, that we're looking at in particular are first of all capabilities. To what extent can EU R&D in security benefit capabilities that we both need? Enhanced cyber capabilities, tankers to refuel aircraft, what we call ISR, information surveillance reconnaissance, the critical enablers that you need for modern military operations. So in other words, sharing more the R&D and the capability programs so that we don't waste money, time and effort duplicating each other. That's one example. Secondly, as I mentioned already, this hybrid warfare issue, to share intelligence and information, to have a common picture of what's going on, to use the EU civilian instruments and the NATO military instruments together, because all security issues today come in the form of, all challenges come in the form of networks. Terrorism links up with organised crime, links up with social media, etc., etc. So you can't defeat a network threat without constructing a network yourself. And I think the UK has pioneered this approach of, the whole of government approach, network security. The development agency talks to the Ministry of Defence, which talks to the Foreign Office, which talks to the Home Office on border guards, putting all of the assets together. And I think the UK has pioneered this approach both in the EU and NATO in a way which has allowed the organisations to come closer together. So if you look at the challenges from the East, in terms of a resurgent Russia, putting pressure on allies in Eastern Europe. If you look at the South, all of the complex issues of civil war, of demographics, of difficult economic situation, climate change, jihadism. We're only going to solve these issues, as I say, if we put all of our resources in one basket through closer EU-NATO cooperation. Would it happen without the UK? Well, probably yes, but it will happen faster and more effectively if we have a UK which is equally influential in both organisations.
Out of the 1,000 or so international staff at NATO, given that Britain and France are two major European military member states, how many British staff are there? And given the debate about the underrepresentation of Britons in the EU institutions, is Britain overrepresented, underrepresented, or is the proportion of staff per member state is about right in NATO?
Well, that's a good question. I confess, Arthur, at the top of my head, I don't have the exact figures of the number of UK members of the international staff, but at least from my own experience, I think we are well present. We have, for example, a British Assistant Secretary General, Patrick Turner, who runs NATO operations, so that's a particularly important position. The Director General of the International Military Staff, which is one of the most senior positions here, is Sir Christopher Harper, a British, as you can imagine. The Deputy SACEUR, very important person in our command structure. The second most important position after, of course, the Supreme Allied Commander, who's always an American, is Sir Adrian Bradshaw. He's at Shea, where you're going later. So the UK occupies a number of key positions, which I think reflects also its big contribution to NATO, because in terms of budget, in terms of troops, ships, I mentioned the nuclear role. The UK is one of the largest contributors and has been systematically. For example, it's one of the 5 countries, I wish there were more, but it's one of the 5 countries which meets the NATO commitment to spend 2% of its GDP on defence. I think on the EU side, again, I'm not from the EU, so you should ask them, but I think on the EU side, you'll find that there was a generation like me of Brits who came over to Brussels in the early 1970s and who have achieved very significant careers in the EU Commission. I know them all, and they've been Director Generals, like Philip Lowe, if you need the names, Jonathan Fall, Robert Madeleine, because they spent their careers there, but they're now retiring because, like me, they're arriving at the end of the career. And what maybe is lacking as far as the British and the careers in the EU are concerned is the sort of successor generation of people who were born at the end of the Cold War, as the Berlin Wall were coming down, and who would have looked to Brussels. But I think it's not just an issue for Britain and the EU. As somebody who teaches at universities and speaks to professors, they tell me that their students who are not as interested in public service careers, they're more interested in the City of London or business or whatever, or media, and maybe less interested, as I say, in public service. So I don't think it's just that the Brits do not want to work in the EU. I mean, that's not true. There are many Brits obviously around, but I just think it's maybe a less of an interest for public service than maybe was characteristic of my generation. The attitudes changed. But that said, I mean, there's still obviously a British EU Commissioner, Lord Hill. Until recently, the UK with Baroness Ashton, Cathy Ashton, occupied a very important position of the High Representative for the Common Foreign and Security Policy. So it's not as if there are no Brits in Brussels. Quite the contrary. We're about 50,000 strong, and so we're quite a significant community in this city.
Would British NATO staff be affected in any way by a British withdrawal from the EU? And if so, how?
Oh, that's an interesting question. To some degree, we have to recognise we are separate organisations, obviously. Although we want to cooperate very closely, we're autonomous and separate. And there's no talk, as you know, during the Brexit campaign of leaving NATO. Indeed, I don't agree with this view, but many of the people who are in favour of the Leave campaign say that we don't need the EU because NATO would provide all of the security we need. As I tried to say earlier, I don't think, given the challenges we face where we need two organisations together, that is something that I would identify with, but it's a view. So it's not as if, therefore, there will be a Nexit, if I can use that term, to go with a Brexit. But if the UK and the Leave campaign says that it wants a strong NATO for the defence of the UK, I would say that means that the UK also has to be part of the European Union. It's not an either or. It's, as Benjamin Franklin would have said, we either hang together or we hang separately. I think there's an element of that. So we will be here on the UK side in the international staff soldiering on. But as I mentioned, I think not having the UK in the EU in terms of the ability to perform our own tasks of providing this whole of government security package, our work, of course, would be affected. Of course, the other thing is that many Brits, of course, who live in Belgium have this great advantage of not having to have work permits or residence things because of the freedom of movement in the EU and the Schengen freedom of movement and so on. So, to some degree, our work is made easier because we have those advantages that come from Britain's EU membership, of course. But that said, no, the organisations are different. We have to be quite clear on that, and our own employment or status wouldn't be affected.
The target audience for this interview, as you know, are for young people born since the end of the Cold War. And what would you say to them about the relevance of NATO and the broader transatlantic security and defence community to their lives and their futures?
Well, you know yourself that security, the enjoyment of security, which we all take for granted, is fundamental for everything we do. And we live, unfortunately, today in an environment where we can less and less and less take that security for granted. We had a sort of golden period at the end of the Cold War when the challenges were thousands of miles away in places like Afghanistan, and there was a sense that, well, maybe we participate, maybe we don't. It's optional. We can choose to engage or we can choose to stay on the sidelines. But today you look at the migration crisis, you look at the threat of terrorism, you look at the proliferation of ballistic missiles by a number of actors. You look at, as I mentioned, resurgent Russia, the return of great powers, the fact that 4 major wars are going on today in the Middle East with enormous death tolls. The idea that we can build a fortress Europe and detach ourselves, disconnect and live in peace, declare neutrality and opt out, no, that's completely impossible. We have to work harder and harder and devote more resources if we're going to enjoy that level of security that we've all grown up with. And you just see a terrorist attack in Belgium. If we can't prevent a terrorist attack, not only are there lots of casualties, but the airport shut down for weeks and weeks and weeks. The economy takes a nosedive. Suddenly, you can't go to places or you can't get into buildings. You see immediately the impact on your personal life from security not being achieved. So the function of NATO is to provide that security. It's to keep the critical mass of effort, forces, investments, people around the same table, agreeing on strategies, sharing the burden, achieving it together. And that gives us together a security that none of us individually, certainly not the UK, not even the United States, I would argue, would be able to achieve by itself. We need to stay together, particularly in this current environment. And with NATO, hopefully in 10 years, 15 years, we'll be able to get a grip on these challenges and therefore go back to the security that we enjoyed and took for granted, just a decade ago. But we know now that it doesn't come from God or heaven. It's the result of what people do or people don't do.
Indeed it is. So during his recent state visit to the UK, President Obama appealed to the younger voters to use their vote in the EU referendum in Britain next month. As the US is a very the most important NATO member state, do you think he has the right to do that from a NATO's perspective, or was he, as many people have argued, he was just interfering in domestic British politics?
No, I think he does have the right to intervene in the debate because the British people, first of all, need to know all of the implications and consequences of a choice to stay in the EU or to leave the EU. And what allies and partners think, not just what people within the UK think, I think is a key part of that debate. They need to know the facts. There's a famous judge in the United States, Oliver Wendell Holmes, said, everybody's entitled to their own opinion, but everybody's not entitled to their own facts. And I think, therefore, getting the facts from people who are in a good position to sort of appreciate the impact is key, and the US president is a major player. The second thing is that, I think the British voters are sufficiently mature to be able to hear the facts and the views and make up their own minds on these issues. And I'm quite certain also, vis-a-vis the Leave campaign, that if somebody comes up with a very important statement internationally why the UK would be better outside the EU, they would probably be happy then for that to be cited. So we've got to be fair in a referendum that everybody's got the right to express their opinion. But I think also what President Obama said, it's important that it shows that the UK counts in the world. It's a very, very important actor. But what he said is that the UK is an important actor, not simply because it's a country with a geographical territory in a particular place, with a particular economy, but the UK counts because it's connected. The UK is influential by being part of things, part of NATO, part of the EU, by being a player at the table. That's what makes the UK important. So in other words, you're only important to the extent that you're integrated in a family of nations. And that's good for British security. I think that's crystal clear, but it's good for the security of others. So it's not about just the benefits that you get. It's also about what you contribute. I mean, one of the things that frankly does worry me a little about the debate that you have in Europe at the moment, not just the Brexit debate, but the debate on Schengen, on borders, on migrants, that it's all about me, what I benefit, how I get all of the best things and get rid of all of the bad things, how I put up barriers and keep all nasty things out, me. It's not about my obligations to others, my responsibility, my commitments, the type of country that I want to be in the world, what I need to do to keep the rest of humanity. And I think that a major country like the UK, which is a major country with its history, we just don't need a debate about how we can squeeze more benefits out of something, and but how also we live up to our kind of image we have of ourselves, about how we participate and contribute to the rest of the world. Responsibilities and not just rights. And I think Obama, if I can say so, articulated that kind of vision, which to my mind is a more generous type of vision of our future.
As you mentioned before, since the end of the Cold War, the nature of threats confronting the transatlantic community has radically changed. The so-called emerging challenges such as climate change, cyber warfare, counterterrorism, and counterinsurgency, and most recently, of course, the so-called hybrid warfare. Given that these threats go well beyond the remit of national defence ministries. How, in your professional judgment, should NATO best play its part in this new security and defence environment?
Well, it's very important that we cover the entire spectrum because when we first started out in the alliance nearly 70 years ago, security was basically sort of territorial security, borders, land, preserving control of your own territory. Today we've still got that. If you look at obviously what happened to the Crimeans being annexed by Russia or Russian incursions into eastern Ukraine, protecting your territory still matters, and we're doing that obviously, particularly in the east at the moment with a greater projection of NATO forces to show our determination to protect our latest members from Poland, the Baltic states, Romania, Bulgaria, and so on, and maintaining effective deterrence. So that hasn't gone away, but a lot of security today is what we call human security. It's not only protecting territory, it's protecting people, it's protecting interests, it's protecting a way of life, the functionality of your society. We live in this globalized world where if we're going to earn our living, things have got to work. Transport systems have got to work, energy has got to flow through pipelines, electricity has got to be able to be delivered by grids, so planes need to be able to land in airports, and as I've said earlier, if that gets disrupted, very soon people's livelihoods, national economies take a nosedive. So it's true, your own physical life may thankfully not be at stake, but still, your security is your ability to go about your normal life. But of course, in terms of terrorist attacks, people lose their lives and get wounded, and their physical security is also impaired. So we need to, as security broadens, NATO has to broaden. To be relevant, we have to go where the threats are. We can't be dealing with yesterday's threat. Governments would stop financing NATO and contributing troops quickly if they felt that it was no longer a force multiplier for their interests. Whereas, thankfully, a military attack is still comparatively rare, I touch wood as I say this, cyber attacks take place every minute, second of the day. We have every month 200 million types of incident, 200 million on NATO's networks. And of course, not all of them are massively significant, they're probes, but still, every month we have about 2,000 more serious incidents. And if that's true of NATO, it's true of every government, it's true of every bank, it's true of every insurance company, it's true of every innovation company. So there's no choice but to deal with those kind of threats. But the NATO approach to traditional threats is also the approach to new threats, analysing the issue together, sharing technology, sharing intelligence, coming up with common standards, benchmarking, stress testing systems to make sure that they work. Again, you can't, on cyber, protect yourself by your, alone. I've dealt with cyber, for example, for the last 5 years, and what's really struck me is if you don't have a good dialogue with industry, if you don't have a good information sharing, malware sharing service, if you're not also looking at what's going on in the police and the organised crime world, you can't protect yourself on your military networks. Cyber really demands a massive number of contacts to be able to deal with. That's the way security is going. So it's not NATO alone any longer. As I said with the UK, it's how effective you are at getting others to cooperate with you, and in return being able to cooperate with others. It's you scratch my back and I'll scratch yours. This whole debate, we need to sort of realise this, that you can disconnect, but like disconnecting your computer, if you start disconnecting from things, you also, of course, lose your ability to function. So instead of pulling those wires out, what we need to do is plug more of them in. That's what security is about these days.
In the light of these emerging challenges, would Britain be safer, less safe, or about the same, in your professional view, if Britain votes to leave the EU?
Well, the point of it all is not, frankly, in Europe, out of Europe, although I believe we should be in Europe. The point is that we are a European country. The channel is 22 miles wide. and it will always be 22 miles wide, which means to say that we will be geographically and therefore politically, socially, economically part of Europe. We can't function unless we are part of Europe in economic terms, in security terms. The British tourist will still want to go as quickly as possible through the Channel Tunnel, off to his or her holiday home in France or Spain. The British trucks will want to get over to the continent and drop off British cheese to Italian markets as quickly as they can. We can't not be part of Europe. It's a total absurdity. So my sense is that if we do leave, we would need to sort of renegotiate most of the aspects of membership bilaterally. Of course, the British voter has to decide whether all of those bilateral agreements would literally mean the same thing as membership, but without Britain being at the table to influence the decisions, which is what my personal view is on this. But we would need intelligence cooperation with the EU, military cooperation with the EU, R&D cooperation with the EU, financial coordination, internal market coordination, and so on with the European Union. So to some degree, the answer to your question is almost impossible to give, because I cannot, with a crystal ball, tell you, if Britain does leave the EU, exactly how fast and how well we would be able to negotiate all of these agreements, which we would need to stay connected to Europe. So what I do say is that by being in the EU, we know what we're getting, and we can improve what we're getting because we have a seat at the table and a voice. By being outside the EU, we don't know what we're getting. Frankly, it's totally speculative, because it all depends on a massive number of very complicated future negotiations, which could produce a perfect sort of outcome for the UK, everything we like and no to everything we don't like, but it could produce a suboptimal outcome. So again, it's the devil you know, if I can use that expression. I don't think the EU is the devil, certainly not. I think it's been a fantastic success story in integration and producing peace and stability in Europe. It's no coincidence that Europe has had its longest period without conflict, a general conflict, and its greatest amount of prosperity since the European Union has existed. I don't think that's a coincidence. But as I said, it's really this whole issue of some degree of predictability about the future against a very sort of unpredictable future. But again, that's only the view of one particular Brit here over in Brussels. Ultimately, the British people have to make that decision, because clearly, like I said, whether it's NATO or the European Union, you cannot have a quality membership which isn't sustained by parliamentary and a good degree of public support and over the long run.
There is even more debate now than usual about the special relationship. In your view, this special relationship just between the USA and Great Britain, as it was in the 1940s, or it is now between the US and the whole of Europe, including the EU, and if the latter, how would the special relationship be affected, in your view, by a British vote to leave the European Union?
Well, again, I think President Obama and a number of senior officials have made this clear, and so don't talk to me, talk to the Americans on this one, and I think they're clear that they want to deal with Europe. We live in a world now of big players: the US, Russia, China, India emerging as a great power as well. We also are living in a world where countries are coming together. We talk about the BRICS, of course. We talk about ASEAN in Asia. We talk about the Gulf Cooperation Council increasingly, the African Union. The rest of the world is coming together in these large, increasingly integrated organisations, because they all know that only by bonding together in, for example, the transatlantic or the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership, that can they really have influence to secure their interests. So the United States wants to deal with Europe, not individual European countries. It's Henry Kissinger's famous query back in the 1970s. I want to phone Europe. Who do I call? I want a European telephone number, because that's how the US wants to do business in a world where it needs the coherence, not just allies, but strong, coherent allies together. Again, Henry Kissinger made this clear 40 odd years ago, back in the 1970s, when he made a very famous speech at Westminster, saying that, you know, henceforth the UK would be of interest to the US to the extent that it was at the heart of Europe. But not just passively at the heart of Europe, but working for a stronger, more open, more US-oriented, less protectionist Europe, a Europe which was not just an economic trading zone, but a political actor in its own right. And whether it's President Obama or President Bush or President Clinton, there's been a lot of consistency from our American friends on this. Even Donald Trump has made it clear that the United States can no longer, in his words, pay all of the costs of sustaining NATO. The US pays today just under 70%, 70%, one country, of the totality of NATO defence spending, and is looking for the Europeans to shoulder more of the burden if the US is going to maintain this commitment, which we absolutely have to have to European security. You cannot imagine that European countries acting individually with no coordination are going to produce that sharing of the burden, which we can only do if we Europeans work together, which we're doing. The UK has played a big role in this by working with the French on rapid reaction forces, on nuclear sharing, working with the Dutch and the Nordics on expeditionary forces, working, say, with the Europeans on naval cooperation for piracy. So, if we want the US to remain committed, we have to do more of our thing. And therefore, as I say, I think that for the US, the UK is an important country, but it's important only because it's embedded in a European network. That's clear. What nobody has an interest in, nobody, is a weaker Europe, a weaker UK, a weaker United States, a weaker transatlantic alliance. We're interested in what makes us stronger, not what makes us weaker.
And finally, there is a great debate among the British expat community here and throughout the EU, for the matter, about the unfairness of expats who have lived outside the UK for more than 15 years being denied the vote in the referendum, which could have an enormous effect on their lives. I am myself half British and can vote in this referendum, but I'm also half Italian. As it happens, I can vote, as I've never lived in Italy, for that matter, but I can still legally allow to vote in Italian elections as an expat. So, in your view, which of the two systems is fairer, the British one or the Italian one, for that matter?
Well, again, obviously the British Parliament, British government decided on these issues, and obviously I have to acknowledge and respect that. But there is a general question which comes up, which of course is that more and more of us now live part of our lives in another country. It's good for us. I think hopefully it's also good for the UK, because we're sort of ambassadors for Britain. When we are living abroad, you have hundreds of thousands of young French, young Italians, young Spanish, young Poles today in the UK and in London, of course. And so I think as we have a greater percentage of our populations living abroad, vis-a-vis 50 years ago, when virtually nobody ever left their country, let alone to live elsewhere, we need to think a little bit about what that means, both in terms of participation in elections locally, as you mentioned, and in terms of still being able to participate in national elections through things like registration and postal vote. So my sense is that obviously this is something that maybe the EU collectively could look at in the longer run, obviously, because I think most of us who are expatriates still would like, you know, to have a contact with our home country. It's not as if we have abandoned that country. On the contrary, we believe we're serving the interests of that country by being in Europe. And so the ability still to be part of the electoral process, I think, would be very welcome. But I'm not commentating on this specific issue. I just feel that, as I say, with a greater sort of melting pot of different peoples and different cultures, which I think is fantastic. I think it's excellent. I think it's economically good. I think it's culturally good. I think it enriches societies. But this issue of how you maintain that kind of political representation, I think, is one that probably we need to look at in the EU in the long run.
Dr. Jamie Shea, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.